up, Keen, everyone? Welcome to the show. This is the Dollar Bin Podcast, your favorite comic book review show about comics you didn't know you should be reading. The Dollar Bin Podcast, for those of you who are just tuning in for the first time, is a show where we review kind of obscure trade paperbacks, miniseries, things like that. And then I dig into my box of Dollar Bin comics that I bought and review one of those too to decide if it's truly a Dollar Bin comic or a hidden gem. And then I tell you all about them. If you're enjoying the show, be sure to share, smash that subscribe button, let me know. And if you have any suggestions on something you'd like me to read or review, shoot me a message. I'd be happy to try and squeeze that in, although I have been spending all my money from the government on comic books, so I have got a ton of trade paperbacks on my shelf incoming. The Amazon guy basically lives at my house. My house is just a hub for Amazon now because they have so many people coming in and out of here all the time. I'm like the Bunny Ranch in Las Vegas. That's how many men are coming in and out of here. All right, guys, we're going to get right into it today with a series that was released in the year 2000 called Steampunk. It was written by Joe Kelly with art by Chris Bachalo. Bachalo. I don't know how to pronounce that last name. The series was released by Cliffhanger, which was an imprint of Wildstorm at the time. Cliffhanger also brought us Battle Chasers, Danger Girl, and Crimson. Those I do plan to cover soon. Crimson probably the soonest, then Battle Chasers, and Danger Girl never. Just because I liked them in that order, as I recall. That could change upon reading them again. They were kind of a throwback to original Image comics, Cliffhanger was, where it was very artist-first, artist-driven, but they had some good writers involved. Joe Kelly is a great writer. He came to fame first writing Deadpool, the first ongoing series for Marvel. He was the writer for number 1 through 33 with artist Ed McGuinness. I still think that might be his best work to date. He had a short-lived stint on Uncanny X-Men, which unfortunately was cut short. He quit claiming too much editorial mandate.
Don't worry. I'm not going to do what you all think I'm going to do, which is just flip out!
He had a notable run on Superman and has done a bunch of stuff for DC. I didn't do a deep dive on his Wikipedia, but as far as memory serves, after he left Marvel with Uncanny X-Men, I don't think he's done a ton for Marvel since then, if anything, honestly. He's done a lot for DC and some other stuff. Good writer. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. The artist was Chris Bachalo. I'm going to pronounce it Bachalo for the remainder of the show and stop correcting myself. He was kind of an alt comic when he first came out. He was an artist for Vertigo's Shade the Changing Man, which was kind of a divisive comic. Vertigo was in a weird time then where it was still kind of underground, but published by DC. It had things like Sandman and Swamp Thing that were really cool comics. People were doing interesting stuff, but there wasn't really a market for that in comics yet. It was still kind of geared towards a younger audience. So Vertigo wasn't a big market share until a couple years later. Chris Bachalo became a little more mainstream as an artist. He helped launch the Generation X series with Scott Lobdell. He has a unique and abstract style that has evolved a lot over the years, though, and I want to say for the better. He seemed to grow into a more traditional artist at first with Marvel. His stuff with Shade the Changing Man definitely has more hints of his current style. He kind of became a more traditional artist at Marvel. I think that was probably kind of Marvel needing him to fit a mold to work for them. And then once he cemented himself, you could tell he really started to get his footing and become more stylized and let his art go a little wild. If you look at his initial run on Uncanny X-Men, which is around post issue 350 to 360, somewhere in there, it is a little wild, a little too wild, honestly, in my taste. I loved that book at that time. That was one of my prime X-Men reading times. And unfortunately, he drew characters in a miniature fashion. Everything looked very scaled down. He was very detailed, and the inkers they put him with were very ink-heavy, dark tones, and it really took away from a lot of the detail he did. But as he kind of became more embedded with Marvel and secure in his job, I guess, he really started to evolve into the artist he is now, which honestly, now consistently, he's my favorite artist in the industry. I buy books just to read because he is the artist on them. He's an amazing artist. If you guys aren't reading stuff like Chris Bachalo, you're missing out. He's truly one of the greats when it comes to comic book art. In my opinion, I think he'll go down as one of the perennial all-stars. He has one of the most unique and recognizable styles of any artist in comic books, I think. As someone who is a fan of both these creators, Joe Kelly and Chris Bachalo, I was really looking forward to this book, Steampunk, when it came out, especially coming from the Cliffhanger imprint. I was a big fan of Wildstorm. Last episode, I talked a little bit about Wildcats and Joe Kelly's run on Wildcats. I do plan on doing an entire episode dedicated to the entire run of Wildcats, volumes 1 through 5. I love Wildstorm as a universe. I love the characters. I think it's very underrated, and I think what DC Comics has done to it is absolutely just a shame. They've really buried some gold that they have there, or just try to integrate it into the DC universe. I mean, you don't need Grifter in the DC universe. Grifter is kind of a version of characters that already existed in comics. You know, make them their own universe and do their own thing. I digress. I'm getting off track. Cliffhanger was an imprint of Wildstorm. Cliffhanger was a throwback to kind of early Image, where you got a lot of flash and flare from these phenomenal artists. You had Joe Madureira on Battle Chasers. You had J. Scott Campbell on Danger Girl, which was probably the lead book of all of them and probably had the most notoriety at first. And then you had Humberto Ramos on Crimson, which probably got the short end of the stick of those first 3 debuting from Cliffhanger. But that honestly ended up being the most consistent and longest running book with 24 issues total. Danger Girl, I think only ran about half that. It's had a couple subsequent series here and there, miniseries, but I doubt they've gotten to 24 issues worth of material by now. Crimson ended up being the best of them. Battle Chasers was the 4th series to come out from Cliffhanger, probably about a year later. And I was really stoked. Again, I loved Joe Kelly. I loved Chris Bachalo. And I was really looking forward to this. And I like a comic book that's set in a wild universe. And I'm not a steampunk guy, rockabilly steampunk guy. A lot of people are into that era. I'm not necessarily into it, but I like the idea of using that backdrop to make a comic book. Marvel kind of did it in their 1601 miniseries, where you take heroes and powers but put it in a universe that's not the future. You know, you put it in the past where you're, pre-turn of the century, and you really have, 18th century stuff. And I think you really have an interesting combination. It's not quite wizardry. You're in a more modern age, but you're not in the future. And I just think that's a great backdrop to use for comic books. And the way they used it was interesting, without saying too much yet. Why am I being coy? Let's just say it. I was looking forward to this book when it first came out, but it really lost steam for me fast. No pun intended. I recently read the entire first arc in the Manimatrom collection. It's the first trade paperback in the Steampunk collection. They made 2 trade paperbacks total. The first one collects a one-shot and issue 1 through 5. And now I remember why I stopped reading this book very quickly. I didn't make it through the first 5 issues on the monthly, grabbing them off the shelf at the local comic book shop in the year 2000. I think I ditched it after 2 or 3 issues. So this book follows Cole Blacksmith, who Steampunk tells the story of a young, poor fisherman who's Cole Blacksmith, who falls in love with a teacher, Miss Fiona, in the mid-18th century. Fiona is an upper-class woman who cares for the lower class and tries to educate them, which isn't well received by her peers. Obviously, a lot of class warfare. You thought being poor was bad now. There was no minimum wage in the 18th century. Fiona does give Cole an education. They kind of grow to love each other, you find out, and despite his lack of proper manners and his initial lack of interest for literature and arts, she opens up a school for the underprivileged. The school is burned down because Fiona was teaching the lower class to think for themselves. And we don't like thinking and learning, just like the South. Just a good old boy. The The Republican Party is still on board with all of these concepts. No thinking, no learning. Woman teacher, she must be a witch. Guys, there are a ton of problems with this book right off the bat. Before we get into the art, let's talk about the writing. This book is jam-packed with exposition and long diatribes and monologues. You have long chunks of narration and people talking. It's also very unclear the point of view of the narrator. You're not really sure who is narrating the book. Is it kind of your omnipotent narrator who's watching it? Is it one of these minor characters who's kind of in the mix and watching things? Is Cole Blacksmith narrating it at times? It's very confusing, and it doesn't really ever become clear in the first 5 issues who the narrator is. So you never know who exactly is driving this plot forward and talking about all this. One of the main complaints of this book when it originally came out is its non-linear storytelling. This book was supposed to be 24 issues, and they only made it to 12 due to lack of sales. Pretty rough when Wildstorm can't support a book written by Joe Kelly and drawn by Chris Bachalo. Those are two guys who are titans in the industry now, and arguably Joe Kelly had more clout then than he does now. Chris Bachalo probably doing better now and more consistent, but definitely wildly popular at the time. The storytelling does jump around a lot and is a little difficult to follow. It jumps from the past to these different characters. It's really bad at introducing the characters. I found that I was most of the way through the series, and there's this main guy who leads the resistance in this series, kind of this underground resistance against the main bad guy, and I didn't know his name. He had a couple cronies, and I didn't really know their names either. Due to how much it jumps around in the non-linear storytelling, it doesn't take the time to develop any of these characters or make you care at all. It's little moments with these characters with lots of exposition and lots of talking about things that aren't really connecting. I'm sure Joe Kelly had a plan for this eventually, but man, you got to tie this together a little faster to keep people coming back every month. Bachalo's art is heavy in this book. Heavy in a lot of ways. It's detailed. That, with all the dialogue, makes the pages very crammed. And I don't know if it's the inker or the colorist. Wildstorm had a very unique coloring system that they used, which is part of the reason DC bought them, actually. They chose very dark tones for this book and very heavy lines, which made every page seem very full. And then with all the exposition, all the word bubbles, all the narration, each panel is just jam-packed. And Bachalo is such a great artist that really you should leave room and some breath to be able to appreciate his art. And you can't do that at all due to the coloring, the inking, and all the goddamn exposition. I want to read a comic book, but I also want to look at the pictures. Otherwise, I just be an adult and read a book. Gross. On top of all those issues, this is a time in comic books when digital lettering had really burst wide open and creators were taking very liberal use of the variety of lettering options they had. Word balloons were always looking different. Every character in this book has a different type of word balloon almost, and it makes the whole thing look very jumbled, even worse than it already was, and full and disjointed. And it's more confusing and distracting than anything else. It's not consistent at all. Steampunk may be the worst offender of liberal use of creative lettering and word bubbles over any comic I've ever read in my life. And I've read a lot of comic books. Take, for instance, the main villain, Absinthe. Absinthe, not abstinence. Very different. Abstinence is the villain in Mormonism. This villain in Steampunk has multiple fonts that they use in one word balloon. They use multiple different fonts. They use different sizes of lettering where you have large scale letters, almost 3 times as large as some of the standard print of the other words he's saying. Different colors jumping around, where sometimes in the word balloon where it's standard black words, some words are large in yellow in a different font. Some words are even larger in blue in a different font yet. And there's no reason for it. I don't know what they're trying to accomplish, what effect they want you to get from these different word sizes. Does he emphasize words weird? Does he have a lisp? Does yellow mean he has a lisp and says that weird? Just do little jagged edges around the word bubble, and I get it's kind of a dark tone the way he talks. That's all you need. Plus, you save page space for Chris Bachalo's art. Honestly, it's more distracting than anything else, and it's just more evidence that this book was all style and no substance. If you notice, I haven't talked much about the main character, Cole Blacksmith, and I haven't talked about him much because the book doesn't really talk about him. I was 5 issues in, and I think he said 7 words. He's just kind of dragged around, and he passes out a lot. He should get some blood work done. I think he might be anemic. Literally, he passes out like 6 times in 5 issues. He doesn't ever really do anything heroic. He barely fights. Everyone keeps saying he's the hero that they need to save the underground resistance that's fighting against Absinthe, but he never does shit. Everyone else does everything to fix any problem that happens. He's really more of a liability because they have to drag him as he catches the vapors and passes out. Oh, dear Lord, it's Absinthe again. Oh, no, I do declare. Honestly, you really don't know any of the characters after 5 issues. There's a lot of ancillary characters, Scom and some other guy who's kind of a bad guy. It's really confusing. There's not a lot of follow-up. They're grave robbers, but also freedom fighters. They call them salvagers, I think. There's a lot happening, guys. There's another villain. His name's Faust. He seems to be like the enforcer of Absinthe, but he also kind of doesn't like Absinthe. I'm not sure why he works for him. That's never really explained. Maybe that would go into depth in the other issues that I didn't read, or the last 12 that were never produced. I don't know. He seemed more like a begrudging henchman of Absinthe who did believe in some of his ideals, but also didn't like Absinthe and wanted to kill him too. But we never know why. The most interesting character ends up being Victoria. She's the most compelling and the most fleshed out of all. She actually has some dichotomy. You see some different angles. She starts out being kind of ambiguously a antagonist, but actually ends up being the biggest hero in the whole series. She saves Blacksmith's ass like 3 times. She saves the Resistance. She stops Absinthe. Really, she does everything. I just want more Victoria. She was the coolest part of this book and the only person I feel like I got to know at all. But also, it seems like that was wildly unintentional. It didn't feel like they were trying to give you her. She just kind of fell into this role of being the only person that ended up getting screen time. At the end of the day, I was really unclear about who I'm supposed to care about, who I'm supposed to follow, who I'm supposed to remember, and they all seem pretty boring. Sadly, guys, I love Joe Kelly. I love Chris Bachalo. Again, Chris, I'll buy any comic book that your art is on these days. But Steampunk is a Dollar Bin comic. And now for our actual Dollar Bin comic of the week. This week, I chose Quicksilver #1, dated November 1997 from Marvel Comics. Because his sister Scarlet Witch is getting so much attention with her own TV show and they killed him off in the Marvel universe, I thought we'd give Quicksilver a little bit of love. Now, for those of you who weren't around in the later 90s, it was a pretty exciting time for Marvel Comics. Not because they were doing really well, I mean, because they were broke as fuck and they were desperate. They literally went through a bankruptcy in the 90s where there was a time when they were talking about selling off their assets. There was talk that like they were going to auction off characters and DC would end up with Thor and Wildstorm could end up with Captain America and Acclaim could buy the X-Men and nobody would buy US Agent. But they were in financial ruins, which means they were desperate and green-lighting some weird shit. But it was pretty great as a reader because we got to see a lot of things that normally we wouldn't see. All the traditional titles were kind of floundering. Hulk, Fantastic Four, the Avengers were all in pretty shitty places. That era is kind of bad for anything that wasn't X-Men related. To give you guys an idea, in 1996, they launched a Heroes for Hire book, a Kazar series by Mark Waid and Andy Kubert, which, by the way, is phenomenal. Kazar fights Thanos. The whole fucking Avengers couldn't barely defeat Thanos in the movies, and some jungle guy in a loincloth and a saber-toothed tiger beat him? That's some cool shit. They rebooted Alpha Flight, the Canadian X-Men that Americans care about as much as they care about his hockey. There was a super underrated Maverick series, which to this day, I will die loving that series. And also the aforementioned Deadpool series by Joe Kelly and Ed McGuinness. And also Quicksilver #1. I actually only paid $1 for it. Now, this book was written by Tom Peyer, who's been around forever. He edited a bunch of books. He's written a million things over the years. I mean, this guy's been in the industry forever. I'd say most notably, he had a stellar run on DC's Hour Man in 1999. It lasted about 2 years. That's actually a really great series. If no one's ever read it, I highly suggest it. Beyond that, he's worked on just a bunch of random stuff through the industry. He's consistently worked. He's just one of those writers that's been around forever that you probably for sure have read, just don't really know the name. And with art by Casey Jones, probably most well known for a run on Excalibur and a bunch of other random stuff in the industry. Now, before we get too deep into this book, Quicksilver has always been a favorite character of mine, especially after Peter David handled him in the X Factor run. He really made him into a lovable jerk. He was always one of the heroes that you kind of hated. He was a little bit of a heel. He was kind of mean, arrogant, but he still would do the right thing. Oddly enough, being one of the early mutants introduced besides the X-Men, he was never wrapped up in the X universe that much, him or Scarlet Witch, which seems strange given he's the son of Magneto. I always really wish they would have pulled Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch further into the X universe. They were always so wrapped up in the Avengers universe, and I thought they were awesome characters. Being Avengers and away from that X universe made them more compelling to bring them in and see what their dynamic would be in a team like that. But Quicksilver did have a run on X Factor again, which Peter David wrote. He really made this character into someone, one of people's favorites, and kind of made him fun again. He really had a way of writing every character as a unique person. Peter David's really good at characterization, really great at character-first stories. So with all that in mind, Quicksilver, a character that's been around since the early inception of the modern Marvel Universe. 1963, when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby birthed the modern Marvel Universe. He's one of the first handful of mutants that's ever been invented or introduced in the universe. He's been an Avenger. He's been an X-Factor. He's the son of Magneto. He's married to one of the Inhumans. He has so much going on, and the writers chose to place him with a bunch of animal mutates in Wundagore, some crazy Balkan Mountains Eastern European trash city with the High Evolutionary. He was an Avenger. There's so much you could choose to do with this guy. He has connections with literally every character and team in the Marvel Universe. His wife was a member of the Fantastic Four. We do have to keep in mind there was a lot going on at Marvel at this time. This was post-Onslaught, so the X-Men universe had been kind of decimated. Professor X was gone. The X-Men had kind of become villains in a sense, or, the heroes didn't trust them because mutants had just caused this whole chaos. Mutants are always causing chaos. House of M, Necrotia, Onslaught, the Phalanx Covenant. Man, maybe mutants do need to go away. But for those of you who don't remember, Onslaught ended with the Fantastic Four and the Avengers being seemingly killed. So it left this giant void of heroes in the Marvel Universe and so much opening for these other characters to be pushed forward. And again, they've taken a character like Quicksilver who has connections to the Avengers, X-Men, Fantastic Four, and more, and put him in Wundagore. They put him with these mutates that you don't even know as the backdrop characters, as your background fill-in characters. They should have been pushing him forward as a main hero, trying to get him to fill a void as the Avengers are gone. Move into Avengers Mansion. See what happens. Try to rebuild something with your former compatriots gone, seemingly dead. Why weren't you taken? Why isn't that bothering him? What about him was not heroic enough to die in this instance with his fellow Avengers? All in all, this book lasted a whopping 6 issues, as you can imagine. Casey Jones' art wasn't bad. It was a good fit for Quicksilver. It was a good fit for the lighthearted tale they were trying to tell with these Muppets as the supporting cast for Quicksilver. But honestly, Quicksilver is not a nice guy. This should be a little grittier tale. They came close to a story, too, because the former disciple of Magneto, Exodus, and the Acolytes come and try to steal Element E, which I assume stands for evolution from the High Evolutionary. That, or he's just making some bomb-ass ecstasy and everyone in Wundagore is partying like crazy. Maybe those mutates aren't actual animal people running around. Maybe they're just people in furries costumes. and they are raving like crazy. So you even have Exodus show up, which is a connection to Magneto, which is probably arguably the most interesting part about Quicksilver, is that he's Magneto's son. So again, all these elements that they didn't play up any of them. They completely missed the best parts of him, and kind of dumbed it down to make it seem like it was going to be a book for kids. And I realize comic books can be for younger audiences, but a character like Quicksilver isn't the guy you go with. So unfortunately, I gotta say, Quicksilver #1, you are also a Dollar Bin comic. All right, guys, that's it for this week's show. We appreciate you hanging out. Make sure and follow the Social Hour on Facebook for updates on everything going on. Follow the Dollar Bin Podcast on Facebook. Also, go to deececomedy.com. Check out all the news on me. The YouTube page. If you're watching this on YouTube, you get some extra bonus goodies. If you're listening to this as a podcast, go follow it on the YouTube page. You get some bonus goodies. Also, guys, check out the Social Hour podcast every Tuesday and Thursday, as well as Some Imperfections, the advice show I host with certified life coaches Abby Buckenberger and Sierra Cossi every other Wednesday. That's it, guys. Follow me at deece.comedy on Instagram, all that jazz, and we will see you next week. Peace!